trailer with us and went down and did some camping and stayed a few nights down there, and it was nice. That was the end of March.
Yeah, that's very recent.
Yeah, so the end of March, it's not too hot down there.
Yeah.
It was still in the 90s in the middle of the day, the low 90s, and you know, that'd be a great day in Sacramento, right? So in the middle of August, but we're not at all used to that, and so when we were down there, it felt pretty uncomfortable at times, but in the evenings and the night, it was very nice. So.
Well, it cools down pretty well, doesn't it?
Oh yeah. Yeah, but not too cold also, because it could be either extreme.
Yeah, really.
I think their highs in March, like for the record, was up to 115, and their lows are, you know, down around 10 or 20 degrees.
Yeah.
So we got lucky. No wind. It was all good. But that was my last vacation.
That's a good one. If you're ready, they're ready.
Okay.
You ready?
Sure.
All right. Okay, here we go. What advice would you give to new PEs?
The advice I'd give to new PEs is that you are sort of the leader of the band in some sense. Now, you're not necessarily the manager in overall charge, but you play a huge role, and your role is very critical. So other functional units are looking to you to provide them the data that they need to get started and to get going and to get moving. And it's so very critical that the project engineer be able to provide them what they need and in some kind of timely manner, and be able to, basically, if you can't answer the questions, be willing to go and seek out the answers and to find the reasons for what needs to happen or what's going to happen or what you think might happen. And so you need to have a willingness to talk to folks. It's not just about sitting at your desk and typing out emails, but also to be willing to give them a call on the phone, or better yet, if you're in the same building, you go talk to each other face to face. So I see the role as the project engineer as the most critical role in some sense on the projects. Everybody has a role, but the project engineer is really the one that's out in front trying to gather the materials so that folks can keep moving forward.
Great, thanks. I'm going to ask the intro part, Mark. Sorry, I forgot that. I'm going to do it now. Okay. So we're going to do like a little segment where I just want you to give us your name, your current position, your role on the Placerville project, and the time frame for when that happened, when your role was.
Okay. Like in years? I'm not sure I can say.
Well, you don't have to say in years. Clark did it in phases.
Okay.
You say, I'm.
Okay, so my name is Lyle Stockton, and I served a lot of roles on the project. When I first started on the project, I was serving in the project engineer role, and that obviously is a registered range D position. And I did that for a couple of years when my previous supervisor at the time moved on into another role. Then I moved into hers and became, as a promotion, a design engineer, senior engineer. I'm still currently a senior engineer, a senior transportation engineer, although I no longer work in design. So while I was the senior engineer, I still remained on the project. There was a year of overlap when they had no project engineer to replace myself. So I served both as the project engineer and as the design senior at the same time. It was pretty taxing and challenging. So after about a year of that, I realized this was not going to work anymore for the long term, and another project engineer was found and put on the project. I continued on as the design engineer, design senior engineer for, I don't know, maybe another 4 or 5 years, but at least throughout the rest of the project and on through construction, I was in that position until it was completed construction. And at that point, I moved out of design over to headquarters.
Great, thanks. I'm going to go back to the questions now.
So what do you do when you have a tickle on your nose?
I get to scratch mine. You. We just break.
Okay.
You ready?
Yep.
Okay. How would you define a PE's role? Oh, already. I did that one, right?
Yeah.
What advice would you? No, I asked you what advice we give them.
Well, I don't know. There's a very similar question. So we did the first one.
We did the advice.
Is that the first one?
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Do you have other advice you would? You talk about roles and responsibilities. Talk about the role. Do you want to add to that, or do you want to?
Well, what was exactly the second question?
The second one is, how would you define the PE's roles and responsibilities?
Well, it's very similar to the first, but yeah, I don't have anything to add to it at the minute. Maybe we can come back to it later, I'm not sure, but.
Okay. Mark, can we come back to maybe just re-ask number 2 at the end, just to get a separate piece? Okay, will you help remind me on that?
Okay.
So we'll just come back to it, get some distance from it, and come back to it. All right, what criteria do you use to evaluate the success of a project?
Well, to me, the overall success and kind of what was beaten into me, and or maybe drilled into me in a gentle manner, is that does the project meet the need, the purpose and need? That defines the overall success of the project. But it really does go far beyond that. I mean, the need and purpose is what the department has agreed to and bought into as why we're building this project, why we're willing to spend money on this project, and what we're trying to accomplish with this project. But there's really more to it than that. I mean, success can really be, how did you interact with those around you? How did you interact with the rest of the project development team? How did you interact maybe with the local public and the stakeholders that were involved in the project? Because that is where much of the success would fall. If you're not accomplishing what it is that they hope you to accomplish, then maybe your need and purpose isn't right, but they're really linked, and overall success feeds into both things.
What advice would you give to a PE coming in late on a project, and are there any specific strategies you would recommend?
So advice for a project engineer that might be coming late to a project, coming in late as it's already started its development process, and you may be finishing it up or starting off from where it got left off from the previous person, is it can be challenging because you don't necessarily want to go back and rework all of that work that was done previously, but yet you need to somewhat agree to it. So were the decisions that were made were documented? Can they be found, and can you build off of those? Those are some of the questions you need to ask yourself and to look into, and ask others on the team as well. But you can't be the other person. There's not necessarily a pair of shoes there that you're trying to fill. You're trying to move forward with the best way that you think the project should be done, keeping in mind the overall goals and the purpose and need of the project.
Can you discuss the importance of understanding the physical three-dimensional layout of a site?
Say it again, please.
Can you discuss the importance of understanding the physical three-dimensional layout of a site as opposed to a set of plans that's two-dimensional?
Okay, so the overall importance of the three-dimensional physical site. And I guess what comes to mind for me when we talk about the three-dimensional site first might be that, have you been out into the field? This is a real place, and field trips are invaluable. On the Placerville project, we walked up and down that corridor, that route where the project's at and its near limits multiple times, not just multiple, but dozens and dozens of times. And each time you're looking at something different maybe, and you're trying to take it all in, but it's invaluable to be out there and to learn what the site looks like and some of the challenges that you might be up against, things that you wouldn't have realized were out there that actually exist that you're not getting from a survey. The survey data is another three-dimensional piece of information that you're getting, and it's often in the form of DTM, a digital terrain model, that the engineer's working with to use in their design. And that's also critical to be able to lay that out. But my most important point that I think I would share in regards to three-dimensional terrains is that walking the site is extremely important.
What is the PE's role after PS&E?
The role of the project engineer after PS&E, I mean, you've done the bulk of your work, and the project's moving forward through RTL and on to advertisement and hopefully and eventually award and out into construction. And so the project engineer does shift a little bit in their responsibilities as those other phases move into place. And your role as a project engineer would largely be to support those other functions that have taken that project over, that they've taken on, say, an office engineer, or that they've taken on out into construction. And you're in support of the project, and you play a critical function as it's out there. There's going to be, a set of project plans doesn't just arrive in a vacuum. There are going to be questions that come up. There's going to be issues that arise, and there might be some redesign work that takes place. So those are all important points that the project engineer needs to be prepared for, or at least willing to take a step at or stab at rectifying or resolving.
Great. Can you give us a brief introduction of the Placerville project?
Okay, so the overall Placerville project, just to set context, might be that this is a corridor that's within a small town, the city of Placerville. It's actually incorporated, of a population of about 10,000 folks. And it sits just 8 miles north of the historic Coloma Gold Discovery Site, which is one of the most significant locations as far as California history goes. And it's got a tremendous amount of gold rush history going on within its boundaries. Our project stretches from right down in the downtown core. Our project parallels Main Street, and we're between Highway 50, which is existing out there, and Main Street. There falls a creek, the Hangtown Creek they call it, as well as historic buildings, brick buildings, gold rush era you might think of. And then further out in the project, further to the west, might be more of a undeveloped state. And so the project here is we got an existing highway. It's a 4-lane expressway, and it's freeway all the way from Sacramento. Keep in mind that that might be 12 lanes wide, and it narrows down as you get up into the foothills 40 miles east of Sacramento into the town of Placerville. It goes down to a 4-lane freeway and then abruptly stops at 3 traffic signals. And these traffic signals really changed the feel of the route. That portion of the route was built in the 1950s. The freeway immediately to the west was built in the 1960s, and both portions are within the limits of the project. And so you've got a lot going on here. You've got this small town community, which desires to probably hang on to that feel. Plus, you've got this large 4-lane facility that has been freeway all the way up to these traffic signals. And it's expressway there within the limits, and then it continues on to the east before it dwindles down to 2 lanes. You've got major metropolitan areas like the San Francisco Bay Area and Sacramento that have weekend visitors that are traveling this route to go to Lake Tahoe and resort destinations that are up there. They're all passing along here. Typically, a person might go up on Friday or Saturday and return back on Sunday, Monday. And so you've got a huge amount of interregional trips going on, in addition to the local trips for the local community. The way the route was set up and laid out in its prior state before the project was such that the locals, in order to connect their downtown and go to their secondary business district immediately to the west, you had to get on Route 50. There were some back roads that were pretty windy and around, but and as a minimum needed to cross Route 50 or to travel along Route 50 to connect those 2 business cores. And so that's kind of the setting of the project, and that led to the challenges that the team experienced.
Please describe what you would consider the critical path elements of the Placerville project, and which of those elements would you consider the most important?
The critical path elements of the project, and maybe which most important, I would say that, well, obviously staging and working the staging out was of critical importance, because during the design process that was a big question in our minds, and how to build that. Given the dynamics of Route 50 as it passes through Placerville, this is their main connection between their centers of business and as well as their centers of housing. And so you can't just shut things down. So we had to do various different construction staging scenarios to try to make that work. But another challenge that, in addition to staging, that comes to mind and was very large for us was the utilities involved in the project. So we had numerous utilities. We had city sewer and city water, and we had a local irrigation district which had some facilities in the area. We had aerial telephone lines, underground telephone lines, some parallel within the route itself and some outside, and it was all designated a scenic corridor. So that had some ramifications as well as far as adding to the aerial utilities and what needed to be moved and placed underground that we were touching. There was a major trunk line for telephone service. PG&E power lines obviously were within the corridor and crossing the corridor and parallel to the corridor. These are some of the challenges.
What were the most challenging aspects of utilities on this project, and how did you approach working on those challenges?
Okay, so the most challenging utilities in themselves were maybe one of the largest challenges on the project. The first thing that comes to mind is the sewer line. We had a existing sewer line. It was actually two lines that ran down the creek that sat right at the edge of our right-of-way. And within this creek, this exposed sewer line sat up on pedestals a couple of feet on these pedestals, very visible in the creek. One was an older line that was probably a 24-inch diameter line that could have been there since the 30s. The other line was a more recent line put in the 80s, the 1980s, that was a little bit larger. And connecting to these lines were coming out of the back of all these historic buildings were individual utility connections to each and every building. So you had these lines, you had more lines connecting to them, and there was no connectivity between the two sewer lines. And the reason the sewer lines mattered, they weren't in our right-of-way at that point, but that we had 4 bridge crossings that went over this creek. And so in order to to widen these bridges or to replace at least one of these bridges, this sewer line was in conflict, or actually 2 sewer lines and one on either side, so it was more of a doubly conflict. The 2 lines weren't connected, and there was great desire by the city and by the community to put these lines somewhere else. And so we knew that we needed to move them out of the way of the bridge construction. We were widening into the former railroad right-of-way, and the city had never had opportunity to put their lines in that right-of-way when the railroad was still there and in service, and that was the desirable place to put it, just given the way that it was all hooked up and plumbed to the rest of the town. So the city was approached, we told them this stuff's in conflict, and they asked if between these 4 locations of bridges, wouldn't it make sense to allow the sewer to be connected, between the points of conflict, and that we would relocate the sewer throughout the length of the project instead of at these 4 conflict points, because you'd have to pull the utility out of the creek, both of them separately, because they were gravity fed and at different elevations, and combining them would have required some pumping and for eternity basically. So we would have to pull those utilities around each of those bridges and put them back in. And so some studies were done. The city asked that they be all combined into one relocation and placed within the CalTrans right-of-way or nearby. And so that was the way that issue was resolved. But utilities in general, we met with each of the utility companies, or all the utility companies as a team, once a month for 3 years. Those were extensive meetings, and each meeting had its own issue, and each utility company had its own individual issues, and they had conflicts among each other as well. So we were working as a team with the utility companies, with the city, and also within our own organization and our functional units to get that work done.
Great. What were the major factors that contributed to the change in cost estimate over the project?
Well, the contributing factors that changed to the costs of the project overall was largely just it was a very difficult corridor to grasp the scope on originally. So the PSR identified some preferred or some alternatives, and those alternatives were further studied and finally one selected. But not worked into that was some of these utility issues. So there was some additional costs related to utility relocation that wasn't captured before. And then it was just the project went on a very long time as far as development goes, and so there was escalation of costs throughout that as well. Then some design standards would change a little bit, and as far as in that area, maybe ADA requirements, Americans with Disabilities Act requirements for access. You know, if we have a pedestrian overcrossing that was in conflict of the widening of Highway 50, so we had to tear that structure down and replace it with something more compliant. So standards would even change throughout these long life projects.
Okay. What were the major factors that contributed to the change in schedule over the course of the project?
The factors that attribute to the change in schedule over the project were that the complexity of the job. The job had so many small, complex points, and the space was so limited that we had to work within, that it would take a long time to figure out all the details of all these minutia of issues. And that also comes from the need to work with other stakeholders and with the community as well. We had multiple public meetings and meetings with the city council, and we had multiple meetings with the utility companies, and for each of these, we were meeting monthly with utility companies, but for each of these, we would learn of some little conflict or issue that hadn't really been considered previously, just the nature of being so constricted within the limits of the project and within what we had room available to work. So the schedule did get pushed out from time to time, and considerably so, but you know, the team is doing the best that it can with working within the constraints, and that was the challenge of the project.
What were the factors considered in deciding to relocate the sewer as part of the highway project? Talked a little bit about sewers, so let's talk about the factors that led to the inclusion.
So the factors that led to the inclusion of the sewer into the project were the fact that the sewer was in conflict at 4 locations with bridge construction. 2 sewer lines on either side next to the footings. The sewer needed to be moved in those locations, either temporarily or permanently. And there was a fear that even if this one line is at least as old as the 1930s, I'm not clear that we knew exactly how old it was, but it was very old, and it was plumbed to each of the buildings. So we had difficulty just moving this line and getting the single line out of the way, because you had these utility hookups to it at intermediate points all throughout its length. And then you couldn't combine the 2 lines because of the different elevations and requirements downstream as far as pipe sizes and what capacity each can handle. So some of the other issues with utilities and the decision that it pulled out, it was the city requested that the sewer line be moved. There was a desire to get it out of the creek. The creek is an otherwise nice resource, but there was these 2 utilities or 2 sewer lines that were on pedestals and very visible within the creek, and they wanted more of a natural setting. I can imagine that this utility hookup, the way it evolved over time, could have very well just been an evolution as the Gold Rush buildings and community were built, and the creek being the discharge point for some of the buildings itself, and it eventually was combined into a sewer line. There were some within the city that felt, some of the local folks that felt that the reason the sewer was there was because of the state of California, whether we put it there when we built part of Route 50 in the 1920s or later in the 1950s. I never found any specific evidence that pointed to that, but there was a general belief within the community that CalTrans in the state of California had some responsibility for it being there and wanted to find a solution, or at least be helped in finding a solution. So there were eventually shared costs on the sewer, in that the conflict points required us to move the sewer in those locations, but in between those locations, the sewer was moved at the city's expense.
Great. What effect did the hard rock have on the project?
Okay, so Placerville sits in the California foothills, and it's Gold Rush community, and so there's rock types of a lot of different varieties. And while you walk throughout the project or drive throughout the limits of the project, you'll see multiple types of rock. Some look hard when you look at cut slopes, maybe to the west of within the existing freeway corridor. You can see exposed rock that's very hard, and then as you go further to the east, you can see rock that's very soft and quite rippable, in fact crumbling from the cut slope continuously, and our maintenance forces are out there, cleaning it up. But so it's difficult to ascertain exactly what you're going to be going through when you dig out there. We figured just by looking at the bottom of the creek that there was a high potential for encountering hard rock, because the bedrock of the creek, which was only 30 feet from the edge of the highway, very well looked like bedrock type material when you physically looked over the edge of the creek and down under the water. So it turned out there were hard rock outcroppings that weren't anticipated. When the city hired a designer, a private firm, to design the sewer portion of the project, and they did some additional geological data, and we also had geological data for the bridge structures, both in the as-built state, and I think we even drilled in some of the bridge areas. So we did have some data, and we as a team, a project team, did make some assumptions about encountering rock. The design specifications included specifications for blasting should the contractor need to use that spec, and that was how we planned to account for it, and we included it into our estimate as well.
So that's what you planned for. So how were the hard rock issues or problems resolved ultimately? So
how were the hard rock issues ultimately resolved? In construction, the contractor encountered a substantial amount of hard rock. Some of it was in an unanticipated point where the on-ramp comes up onto 50, right next to the West Placerville undercrossing structure, which we had boring data for. We weren't really expecting the hard rock outcrop to peak in that area the way it did right at the ramp. So there was some redesign effort made there to reduce the amount of hard rock excavation the contractor had to do. We redesigned the profile of that ramp, made it a little steeper, tried to get it over that peak of hard rock right around the ramp area to reduce his need for excavation right at that point. Now the contractor also encountered extensive hard rock for the sewer excavation, and he's digging in a trench next to the creek and near the buildings, and he chose not to do any blasting in those areas, so he did use other methods. But ultimately, he chose some methods that he felt worked for him out on the job site.
Did the project meet the need and purpose as defined by the PID?
The project need and purpose, I believe, was met. What was stated in the PID was pretty accurately what we ended up with. Now, there was a lot of additions and changes getting down that road to meet that need and purpose, but we reduced congestion, especially headed eastbound, because we were able to add a lane and had room to add a lane in the eastbound direction. And we replaced the traffic signals, where now we got 3 lanes headed that way. You can get 530 more cars through those signals, each signal cycle, than you could prior to the job being done. And we met the needed purpose and sense of left turn lanes. It was made more safe, there was more storage for left turns. Tried to, with left turn arrows and such, that would allow cars to make dedicated left turns rather than yielding to cars coming on, and that could have led to additional broadside type of accidents. We improved the circulation for the downtown community there and its connection to the business district immediately to the west. Now the local community, when things are backed up on 50, say a weekend coming up with a lot of interregional traffic headed towards Lake Tahoe, stacking up at the signals, the community now has a alternate route to take. There's a local street that now connects their two main business portions of their town. There's better circulation for pedestrians, probably safer for bicycles. They no longer have to get on Route 50. They've got bike lanes on a local street that can deliver them where they want to be. And pedestrians aren't on the shoulders of the route. There's dedicated sidewalk for the pedestrians along the new local street connection.
Would you consider the Placerville project a success? Why or why not?
Well, I think the Placerville project was a success in a number of ways. It was a success from the standpoint of meeting purpose and need, in that additional traffic can pass through the area. It can do it safer. Bicycles have a easier, safer access as well as pedestrians. But it was also success from the people standpoint. The community had a route that was mostly built in the 1950s, and it had some aging issues on it. So they got this route basically was allowed to be updated, and with that, the enhancements that went along with the project, there was some transportation enhancement activities that were incorporated into the project, both with separate grants as well as context-sensitive solutions that the community was asking for and seeking for, and ways were found to pay for those items. And so they had decorative treatments added to bridges, and more than just standard barrier rail, for instance, was put in. We were able to add decorative treatments to it and place wrought iron railing instead of chain link fence to benefit the community and its look. They were able to match some of the lighting standards that they already had planned installed within their Main Street corridor, could now be added within the project limits as well at the city's request. Signals were changed to look from our standard galvanized type to something that was painted to a color that the city residents were more interested in seeing. So there was a lot of success, and there was success on a personal level as well. The project team, the folks who were involved with the project, in my opinion, learned a lot and built considerably upon their experience with the project. And we learned, how to basically to work together to accomplish this common goal that was easily translated to other, maybe smaller or even larger projects.
Great. Did this project meet the city's expectations?
I believe for the most part the project did meet the city's expectations. There's a lot of the elements that were added into the project for transportation enhancement activities, context-sensitive solutions, multimodal, pedestrians, bicycles accounted for. There was a few issues that maybe the city wasn't exactly happy about, but I think that's part of the process. There's a lot of stakeholders coming to the table and a lot of different opinions, and some of that friction that goes on between those folks that are at the table, whether it be CalTrans or the County Transportation Commission or the City of Placerville or the individual residents or those community groups that had a stake within the project. And from that friction, there wasn't one perfect solution or one perfect answer for all of the issues for each. And so I think we reached some compromises that work for a large portion of those groups. And One that comes to mind that I'd like to share is there was the remainder of the railroad right-of-way. We didn't use all of the railroad right-of-way, and that was partly at the request of the city. So a longitudinal barrier was placed at the edge of the shoulder, and we relinquished what remained of this old railroad right-of-way for a number of uses that the local citizens had voiced wanting to use it for. For instance, some wanted to use it to build a trail, a bicycle trail. Others wanted to have it as a landscaped area. Others just wanted it to be a place from which, you know, they could enjoy the creek and the views that are along that place. And then there was even some that, or many actually, some of the others that wanted it as a trail also were interested in having it be a place where they can continue to put their Christmas trees at Christmas time. So there was all these competing uses, all of these competing desires. And so we took an approach that we will design a project, we will leave at least 10 feet available behind that barrier, and we will relinquish that back to the city to resolve on a local level more of what, you know, the community would like to do, whatever that might end up looking like.
Okay. Was the Placerville project a typical project?
I don't think it was typical in itself. I mean, the Placerville project's not typical in itself in that there's probably not a lot done that are exactly like it. You had this old community and you had this older route and you're trying to improve it for traffic headed for Lake Tahoe, but it was typical in the sense that it had a lot of elements that you would see on other projects. This project had a 4-lane expressway that you might see on a lot of other projects, and this project was kind of behaved, or in this route behaved like a urban area, but yet it was a small community. So you had both elements going on at the same time. You had a lot of community groups that were highly interested in what you were doing there, which might be more typical of a smaller scale project on a rural route in more of a rural area, but yet it was also a freeway that was terminating at these traffic signals. So you had a lot of congestion that you were dealing with, but local issues as well. We still had some wildlife issues such as the red-legged frog. We had to assume presence for. We had a creek nearby that wasn't lined with concrete like an urban creek might be, but it had a sewer line in it that the community desired to get out of the creek in order to make it more environmentally conscious.
Please talk about the importance of team communication on the Placerville project.
Team communication on this project, and probably any project, is of vital importance. And I think that on the Placerville project, we were highly successful with communication, both within our team, within our project development team, also within our design team, within that functional unit, and with those other functional units, but also with the local community. I remember one story about the city engineer, and I hadn't really given it much thought, but he made the comment that, you know, this project has a lot of really great individuals working on it. We're very fortunate to have the team that we have. And so this was an outside individual recognizing that this team worked actually very well together and complemented each other. And that's what a good team is all about, in that you want to play your part. You as a project engineer might be the subject area expert for certain things, but it was also critical for you to get your information that you might own and possess over to other functional units like travel forecasting for modeling, or traffic safety, or over to landscape architecture so they could do their piece, as well as environmental and their environmental footprint and study. We worked really closely together, and that was indicative of our numerous PDT meetings and the individuals willing to meet with each other face to face, multiple field reviews in the field that led to that communication, and multiple meetings with the city, both at a formal level with the city council and informal with staff within the city government functions.
How would you characterize the interactions with local stakeholders on the project?
Okay, how would I characterize interactions with local stakeholders? Again, that was a highly successful, in my opinion, effort to reach out to those folks. And they were this is a community that's very highly involved. Their citizens take a large interest in their community and its history and its culture. And for instance, there was one group that was interested in the gardens. They would go out and find these areas that otherwise were basically weed patches, and with some of them within the right-of-way, some outside the right-of-way, and build a community garden with landscaping to just make the corridor look better, and that was pre-project. So when we came along, it was important that we work with them, and they also asked it of us, and that we accommodate their replacement of gardens that we might be impacting with the project so that they could come back later and replant some areas to improve the look of their community. And it was that kind of interest that led to the elements that we added into the project, both from a context-sensitive solution aspect as well as overall scope of the project.
What lessons did you take away from this project that have been useful in your career?
Lessons that I take away from this project that have been useful to my career is that concept of team environment. My original location when I started with CalTrans was more of a technical standpoint when I was working with the Division of Structures. But when I went over to the roadway side, I guess I didn't really realize how important the people aspect was on our highway projects. That, if it looks like an environment where you're just dealing with cars and we lose sight of all these other important factors, but it's the people element's huge on this Placerville operational improvements project, both in the areas of those folks that you were working with on the project development team, maybe within your own unit as well, myself speaking in design, and other functional units, but just reaching out and talking to the folks in the community. We had numerous city council meetings, public open house meetings, meeting with community groups, meeting with utility companies, that it became, after a while, realized that these were relationships that we worked so closely together that they were one-on-one type of relationships, and you had to foster those and build those to build rapport for both what we're trying to accomplish and between each other, and build a sense of trust. And we delivered on a lot of that trust, and we gained huge benefits. So I think the greatest thing that I walked away with is the importance of the communication and building those relationships, and how important people are within the process of project development on this project and others.
Great, that's a great answer. I'm going to revisit the earlier one.
Okay.
How would you define a PE's role and responsibilities?
I would define the roles and responsibilities of a project engineer as one of the most critical on a project. I remember when I first came to the district, the particular district director that was the district director at the time, commenting that she felt that the project engineer role that she had filled in the largest part of time in her career was the most important role and the most rewarding role that she had filled. And I have to agree with that. That project engineer is critical, and they get to touch so many pieces of the job. They get to interact on a working relationship one-on-one with other functional units, and to reach out to locals in some cases to work with them directly. And so it's down at the working level where you're rolling up your sleeves and you're getting down into the work of it. And when you're working on these roles as a project engineer, you got to remember that you don't necessarily have all the answers at your fingertips, and you've got these other people out there that you need to tap into, whether they're part of your team or people with experience that maybe aren't part of your team that you can talk to. So the project engineer role is critical in orchestrating and getting to other functional units that information that they need to move forward and to do their work. They really can't get started. For example, environmental needs everything they ask for, and sometimes that can seem burdensome, but they can't do their job without the project engineer passing on to them what it is they need, for example.
Great. I'm going to check in with Mark. Mark, anything you want to revisit? Okay, I'm just going to ask if he has any additional, and then we can bring Donna in. Okay, so until Donna comes in, I don't have any formal questions, but
Yeah.
at the end, I'd just like to ask, is there anything you'd like to add, any issue, advice, anything that you just, last thoughts before we bring Donna in?
No, I don't have any last thoughts before.
No last
Donna.
thoughts? Okay.
No, thanks.
All right, he's good, so we can set up for Donna.